Well, let's get into it. We got to start with easily the most interesting coaching hire of this offseason, Bill Belichick at North Carolina. He hires Freddie Kitchens, who's been around the block a lot, former Alabama quarterback, as his OC. Steve Belichick, his DC. Is there any relation there, guys? I don't know. Maybe you're not. And then Michael Lombardi beat out Bill Simmons and Sean Fennessy for the GM gig there to go from the podcasting mic to the GM office for North Carolina. He's talked a lot about the sort of different shape of what his staff is going to look like, what the role of analysts will be versus the on-field coaches. It's got to be an interesting program. Maybe slightly reinventing the wheel. But I guess, Bruce, let's start with you. What did you make of the Belichick hire, and what would be your grade coming out of that?
I'm fascinated because it's rare when you follow somebody like they went from a 73-year-old guy to like another 73-year-old guy. That almost never happens. Whatever you've had,
well,
usually
we do live in America, Bruce. So,
touche. But in that regard, right? You have a guy who, I think, like Stu, who I do the Audible with. He thought he would point to these examples of guys coming from the NFL who bombed or really struggled, and why Bill Belichick didn't make sense. And the thing I would keep going back to him on is, please don't compare Chan Gailey to Bill Belichick. Bill Belichick is the greatest football coach in NFL history.
Yes,
He's won 6 Super Bowls. Don't say, oh, Charlie Weiss was this. Charlie Weiss worked under him. He wasn't him. It's like, so his understanding of football, his understanding of how to teach it, what he's looking for, I think it's on a completely different level. The part where I think this will be eye-opening for him, and I've watched, I know Mike Lombardi a little bit. I've seen him on McAfee a lot and talking about a lot of the things he says. Yes, they make sense. The part that I think is going to be different for them once they're really in it for a while, and I don't want to say for a month. It's one thing to do something for a month. It's one thing to do it for even 6 months. Another thing to do it for a couple of years is you are going to be dealing with, I think Bill Belichick will have success in 2025 because he's going into the ACC. He's not going into the SEC, not even going into the Big Ten, where we just saw Manny Diaz go 9-3 in his first season, and Fran Brown, who'd never even been a coordinator, did a terrific job at Syracuse. Also, when he finished the season at 10-3, like you can do well. SMU with way less recruiting, clout behind it, made the playoff. Credit to Rhett Lashlee. What I think will be the biggest problem or biggest challenge for Belichick is, and this is from talking to coaches who know him well, is going to be, I think, dealing with 17-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds and their families and their handlers will drive him up a wall. I think ultimately he'll be like, I don't need this. That's ultimately what drove, that mentality is ultimately what drove Nick Saban to game day.
Yeah.
And Nick Saban had spent years, and maybe he just reached his point of it. But Nick Saban had been a long-time college coach. Bill Belichick has not coached in college, and he can talk about, well, my dad coached at Navy. Yeah, it was 50 years ago, and it was an academy. This is not what you're going to be recruiting a lot of kids in this environment. And I'm not saying they're going to be bad kids. I just think what he's going to be dealing with for a long time of this, I think he'll get sick of after probably 2 years.
Could be.
I will say this about Belichick. I do think there is a understanding and respect of college football from him in a way that is not always the case with some of these guys who come from the NFL. We remember Charlie Weiss talking about
a decided schematic advantage.
Bill Belichick's not coming in saying like, hey, man, I'm the best. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to kick ass here, which I think is positive. He does seem open to kind of figuring that out along the way. I ultimately graded this a B+ for a few reasons. There are plenty of questions that come along with what he's doing, and some of the assistant hires continue those questions of college experience. Yes, you can coach football. Can you do everything else that it takes to run a college program? So much of being a college head coach is not football. That is the question we need to see from Belichick. How much will he do that? We know he's going out on the road recruiting. That's something Deion Sanders isn't quite doing. He's on Twitter now. He's doing that type of stuff. That's in a positive direction. I think the biggest part of North Carolina hiring Bill Belichick is not the football acumen he's bringing, but it's the excitement and the interest and the finances he's bringing in to North Carolina, because on that contract he signed, it says North Carolina football is going to be paying 13 point something million in revenue sharing. They're going to max out. A lot of schools say they're going to do that. We don't know for sure how that revenue sharing is going to work out and how much money people are going to have. North Carolina says it has the money. It's paying way more money for its coaching staff, its assistant salary pool, all these promises in Bill Belichick's contract. That's an investment from North Carolina that they've never had before. They've never invested in football at that top level. Now they're trying to do that. That's going to be one of the highest paid staffs in the country, one of the highest paid head coaches, and revenue sharing on top of that. I'm assuming North Carolina has the money, considering how much more that is. And I think that is huge for however long Belichick stays. If he does well in a year or two and goes back to the NFL, that financial commitment could create the foundation for North Carolina to continue that beyond him.
I think the thing with Belichick that people don't talk enough about is, at the risk of overstepping, the decided schematic advantage. Like when you look at the success he had with the Patriots, they did a lot of different stuff. Hey, we're going to run 2 tight ends. Hey, we're going to chuck it deep to run Randy Moss. We're going to do all these things. Now, a lot of that's tied to having a pretty good quarterback. That is part of this. But Bill Belichick is such a student of the game of football at all of its levels for all of its history. Figuring out a way where, hey, here's what we have, and here's how we can make it succeed. Like you said, Bruce, in an ACC where you're not going to be facing a ton of juggernauts every week that you just can't compete on the line of scrimmage. Like, I think you can figure some stuff out, and I think that will matter, and being able to figure out how to win that. And I do think it's probably easier to amass talent where he's at now relative to the competition than it was in a way when you're having to budget and figure out all these things with the Patriots. You look at the last couple Patriots teams he had. Yes, there were some draft busts in there, some misevaluations. That's got to be fixed. But they were one of the worst rosters in the NFL. He's going to have, the 5th, 6th best roster maybe in the ACC? And you could improve that, I think, relatively, not easily, but easier than you might be to try and get a bunch of free agents to come in and work their butt off under Bill Belichick. So I think he can figure some stuff out. I think they'll have some success. I think it's a relatively low ceiling, but I think it's a pretty high floor. I think 8 or 9 wins. I would give this an A- just because people are talking about, we're leading the show with North Carolina football. Chris, how much did we talk about North Carolina last year when they weren't giving up 70 to JMU? I'm not sure we did at all. And they've had much. Top 10 picks at quarterback in the draft, multiple in the last few years. They just haven't been interesting or particularly good.
Bruce, I know you don't normally do coach grades like Stu does, but do you have a grade for Belichick?
I did when I made grades on before I came on here. So I was with you, Chris. I said B+, and it's B+ because my skepticism is that it will be a long-term hire. I don't think he's going to coach 3 full seasons there. I think he'll have success for all the reasons we talked about. I just don't think he's going to be there that long. And again, you're talking about a guy who is in his mid-70s. I mean, that's, in this game and the way it is now, it is exhausting, and I think all the things that he's been really comfortable in and dealing with, I'm sure he can say, yeah, I'm used to dealing with agents, but those are people at CAA and really established firms. The people he's going to be dealing with, or Mike Lombardi and him are going to be dealing with, a lot of them are not licensed agents in terms of the NFL. They could be the same age as some of his players are going to be. And that's the part where I'm like, okay, once you're doing that for a long time, how does that work?
Moving on, I feel like Scott Frost, more than any perhaps coach that we're going to talk about today, maybe in the history of college football, is the walking example of Jack Shepard from Lost. At the end of season 3, we have to go back. It didn't work at Nebraska, which everyone assumed was a slam dunk hire. He's been out of football, and he's back at Central Florida, where, every coach sort of says this, he said, well, I shouldn't have left. Obviously the pull of Nebraska was it wasn't even, I think, that tough of a decision at the time. This feels like a wild card to me. I could see this going a number of ways. Bruce, what's your feel for Scott Frost running it back down in Disney World?
Well, count me as one of the ones who thought it was a grand slam hire for Nebraska, and it bombed.
Me too.
You know,
We all
and
did.
the part that's most interesting to me was I remember being there right after he got fired because our crew at Fox did the next week game and it was against Oklahoma. And talking to people there, one of the things that came up was like, hey, why did it go so well there in UCF and just bomb here? And one of the people made the point to me, one of the staff was like, well, at UCF, we took over for George O'Leary, who was kind of an a-hole, you know, and like
Yes.
he knew what he was doing, but he was really hard on the players. We had good players, but when we got there, it was like kind of we loved them up. The players wanted to be around us and they thrived. When we got here, being Nebraska, they took over for Mike Riley, who's a really, decent guy and well liked, but it was probably a completely different dynamic from what they walked in Orlando. So now he goes back there. The grade I gave him was a C plus on this hire. I know they credit to UCF. They swung at a lot of people to see, knocked on some doors, this person interested in that person. Like Scott Frost definitely could do the job there. And I suspect and I hope that Scott Frost has learned this is a different job than the one he had in Lincoln. It's just way different. But I'm sure he has learned and probably better as a better coach than what he was when he left this place, whatever it was, 6 years ago. Interesting coordinator hires. I count me as somebody who I think Alex Grinch is a good football coach. I know people around USC hated him. I saw Alex Grinch when he was the best coordinator Mike Leach has ever had.
I heard about him like 8 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so we've seen him be good. Some of that deal I think was also related to working with Lincoln Riley as the head coach and how that fits. I know Steve Cooper, he's a sharp young coach. This is going to be new for him though. He was with them at Nebraska and he was at Boise State. And they were really good obviously last year. I wouldn't be surprised. Like you said, David, I think this could go well. But just based off of where he's at, I was like, all right, it's either B minus, C plus, and that's where I landed.
Yeah, I think just we will talk about how much the sport has changed. You look at since he left. UCF in Group 5 anymore. They're in the Big 12, graded without Texas and Oklahoma. You have NIL, you have the roster changes what it was. They took over a 1-11 program that they inherited from George O'Leary. If he kills it, I wouldn't be surprised. But if this is like a Tom Herman-esque, like just going south on you, I can't say that would surprise me. This is the one that I have the least feel for. Because at the end of the day, he went undefeated there. That's really hard to do. There's a giant 2017 national champions banner at the Bounce House that he put up. He helped put up there. But just so much has changed since then. I lean kind of B minus. But maybe he's a guy that's really motivated to get it back and figure out some of the things that he did wrong at Nebraska. Chris, where's your feel for this?
I went with B minus for Scott Frost and UCF. It's not the same UCF for the reasons that you said. They're not in the Group of 5 anymore. They're in a tougher conference. Not only that, they are one of the least resourced teams in that conference. I wrote about this a year or two ago when UCF made the jump to the Big 12. They are at the bottom of the country, bottom of the conference in revenue and spending and all this stuff. They're trying to get that up
for a little while, right? So it's not like snap your fingers and that's going to change from the league side of it.
They don't have the billionaire donor to come in and kind of speed things up. The other part of it is he had a ton of talent when he was there last time, and it's a lot harder to keep that talent. There were like a dozen NFL players on that 2017 team that went undefeated. That team was legit really, really good, and that doesn't even include Mackenzie Milton, who got hurt and so therefore didn't end up playing in the NFL. He's back there now on the staff. So you talk about those players he had last time around in this transfer portal world. Can you keep those guys? I don't know. I was there on the field when they beat Memphis in 2017 to win the conference, and everybody knew it was going to be Scott Frost last game. There were Nebraska fans in the stadium at UCF. I talked to some of them for a story at the time. Scott Frost is crying on the field afterward, knowing what's going on. And he said then, and he said now, that if it was anywhere else but Nebraska, he would have stayed. He probably regrets it now at this point based on how everything turned out. It could work. I can't point to what happened last time and say, well, therefore it's going to work again. It's a completely different world right now.
Yeah, well, I remember him crying. I thought it was just because he hated Memphis that much. But we'll move on to Purdue. They hire Barry Odom from the UNLV. Two things on this. Barry Odom navigating the rocky situation at quarterback last year with Matthew Sluka leaving. They bring in Haj Malik Williams, who they had from Campbell. Really admirable in terms of a team management side of like, hey, we're not letting go of the rope. UNLV had a great season last year. He brings Mike Scherer with him, former Missouri linebacker, who's been with him for a long time, the DC at UNLV. My number one question with this is the best thing that ever happened to Barry Odom was getting dumped by Bobby Petrino after like 3 weeks. He brings in Brennan Marion, goes full on the go-go offense. Barry Odom had very hands-off approach to that offense, and UNLV set the world on fire. Jaden Maiava in 2023. Obviously, last year, they still had Ricky White, really special receiver for them. And that kind of fueled a lot of what they did. They were good defensively, but they were really good offensively. And that's my biggest question, because Brennan Marion is at Sacramento State now. He brings, Josh Henson's going to be the OC there. He's been around the block a bit, spent some time at Oklahoma State. That's the big question to me. He'd worked under Lincoln Riley as well. Chris, what do you make of this move from the Boilermakers? A tough job.
Yeah, I grade Purdue's hire of Barry Odom as a C+. I was very surprised by this move because when Jeff Brom left and they hired Ryan Walters, it was a surprising move. They went for a defensive guy because Purdue's history, when they are good, it's the offense. It's the cradle of quarterbacks. It's Joe Tiller. It's Drew Brees. It's Curtis Painter. It's all those guys. And yes, Ryan Walters tried to kind of run an air raid offense, and it didn't really work. So maybe if you have the right offensive guy, it's okay to be a defensive coach. But when Ryan Walters didn't work out, I thought they would go back to try to find some hotshot offensive coach. And instead you end up with Barry Odom, who's not that. So very surprised by that. Josh Henson, he's coming from under Lincoln Riley. He's coached at a couple of different places. I can't tell you for sure exactly what type of offense it's going to look like, but he's kind of a offensive lineman background type of guy. So very skeptical of Purdue, that continues to kind of not follow the old Purdue model of what works there. That is one of the least resourced jobs in the Big Ten, maybe the least. Very hard to win there. They've got some facilities, but not a lot of nearby talent. You kind of want to do something that's going to maximize the talent differential you have. And I don't know. So, but Barry Odom did something at UNLV that I thought was impossible. He turned that into a top 25 team twice, like really unbelievably. So you can't rule it out, but I'm going to say C+.
I'm going to say B. And the only reason I would be even like B+, but for the reason you said, Chris, is because this has always felt like an offensive place. But I thought Barry Odom did a really outstanding job. He learned from his time at Missouri, when he was, took over for Gary Pinkel. It was a really tough situation, and he did an okay job. There wasn't like he bombed.
Yeah.
And then from talking to him a lot and talking to people around him, he really grew and learned from his experience for the next time. And he did an amazing job at UNLV because you're right. There was the Sluka situation this past year, but the year before that, like one of the best quarterbacks in the conference lasted about 2 weeks, and then they had to go to Jaden Maiava. And again, credit to Brennan Marion, and he had it roll in both seasons with backup quarterbacks. And I think he knew he had something in Haj Malik Williams even in the summer. But it's still like they were never that good at UNLV. I mean, it was amazing what Barry Odom did. The other thing that he was really good at, in addition to the stuff you guys mentioned, they were elite at special teams. Like you watch them, they had a good return game. Ricky White, as good a receiver he was a menace on special teams.
9 punts.
So I think those elements are really good. And the part I come back to if you're Purdue is I don't know how, like we're talking about North Carolina, what they were hiring from. Purdue is a much tougher job to hire for than North Carolina. So I don't know who they were going to get, like that person out there you're talking about, like the offensive minded guy, and I'm not saying they could have easily had taken a flyer on Brendan Marion at that point. Like Brendan Marion's ended up being a head coach at an FCS school that we think may end up as an FBS school before too long. I'm not saying Brendan should, jump into a Big Ten head coaching job, but just in terms of like, who was the cutting edge offensive guy that they were going to get? I think it's a big roll of the dice, whereas at least Barry Odom, it seems like really wanted this job from what I heard. And he has proven to be a very, very good head coach. So that's why I land on B, but I think I could have been even higher just based on what I think of him as an actual head coach.
I was going to give him a B, but I downgraded to a B- because he killed the turnover slot machine, which was one of the great things in college football.
Bring it back.
Speaking of reunions, West Virginia, one of the weirder ones. You want to talk about a complicated history? The history between UCF and Scott Frost, not that complicated. It's all pretty rosy. Rich Rodriguez in West Virginia, some hurt feelings, some high moments, the worst loss in college football history as well. But he is back in West Virginia. I'm fascinated with this one. I think it's going to work. I'm going B+ here. I just think he can. There's something about some of these schools where you understand the school, you understand how you have to win. And now, granted, a lot like UCF, West Virginia in a very different place. I don't think he's going to be winning 10, 11 games like he was, but better than Neil Brown, I think he can do. I'm in on Rich Rodriguez working to some degree at West Virginia. A lot of fans got their pipe dream back, and a circuitous route back to West Virginia. Certainly one of the odder ones. But Bruce, what's your feel for this?
I got it as a straight A. I would almost go as A+, because I mean, I remember when he was there. He had that program rolling. He's a really good offensive coach, and like you said, David, he knows the ins and outs of that state and what it takes more than anybody who's coaching right now. And I've seen what he's done at other places. You can say, all right, he bombed at Michigan. I think that was such a bad fit for when he took over, where there was hardly anybody coming back. There was no portal back then. So he couldn't jump up and, eventually he got Tate Forcier and eventually
Stephen Threet, the Stephen Threet era of 2008?
He was
some hilarious Michigan stuff I have not thought about in quite some time.
But eventually he got Denard in there and they got Danger. Right?
Yeah.
But it was 3 years and they were over him, and it was too much culture shock from where they came from. But he had it rolling at Arizona, and he can coach. And you look what he just did at Jacksonville State. I don't think there was, to me, this was a no-brainer hire when I heard he's interested, and I talked to some people who were like, oh yeah, the biggest booster they have wants him. McAfee, who has the biggest voice in not just college football media, but in sports media right now. Pat McAfee has it, and he played for him, and he knows that place, and he's beating the drum for it too. That guy I think is a really, really good football coach. Again, I would be tempted to even go A+, except and also, by the way, the league when they were in the Big East or whatever they were in, there was still more of a at one point he was going out, had Miami around. Yeah. And Miami was much better than anybody in the Big 12 is. It's not even close. So there was a hierarchy there. At some point there was Syracuse, and honestly, Syracuse back then in that era was still really good. I think people forget what they were like under Pasqualoni when they had it rolling with the quarterbacks there.
Shout out to Donovan McNabb. Yeah.
And so to me, I think if I was a Big 12 coach, I would not be happy about that hire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to go. I was right on the A- range. Bruce, I think you talked me into an A. He's just won everywhere he's been, except for Michigan. But even at Michigan, it was getting better before he got fired. His record improved every year. And unlike Scott Frost, who spent the last couple of years kind of out of football or doing some NFL stuff, Rich Rod's right back in it. He went to be Terry Bowden's offensive coordinator at ULM. He goes to Jacksonville State, wins 9 games twice, moving them up to FBS. That's a really hard thing to do. And he just kept winning. And he produced some really good running backs there at Jack State. He's just done it everywhere. He took Arizona to a Fiesta Bowl. West Virginia, multiple top 10 finishes, nearly went to the national championship game in 2007.
Should have gone to the national championship.
13-9 loss to Pitt, which you were referencing there. Never going to forget that.
It is the worst loss in college football history. It is.
It probably is. And Pat McAfee
played
in that game.
Were you a student at Mizzou that day, by the way, Ubben?
What do you say?
Were you a student at Mizzou that day when that happened?
Yeah. Yes, I was. Was that the same day? That was the same day as Kansas Mizzou 07.
Yeah. Yep. I was.
And also that same weekend was Arkansas LSU, when Darren McFadden set LSU on fire and ended their national championship hopes, in air quotes, before they won the national championship a month later. So
yeah, it's too bad. Yeah. It's too bad the playoff is ruining what those games mean, I guess, right? The 12-team playoff.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I was a freshman at Michigan State. I had a Morgantown native who lived on our floor, and he was despondent after the game. It was crazy. But remember, he
should have been.
He almost leaves for after 06. He almost leaves for Alabama. Decides not to. Comes back. Misses out on the championship game. Goes to Michigan. There's a lawsuit over his buyout that eventually gets settled. That's the bad blood you were alluding to, Ubben, is that whole situation. So yeah, I think it's a good fit. And like the dude spent 3 years at Jacksonville State. He won 9 games every time. Like he just wins. So I'm gonna go with an A for Rich Rod.
Wake Forest hires Jake Dickert away from Wazzu. This one hurts my heart. Like, I just feel so bad for Wazzu and Oregon State, who have lost tremendous coaches. And it just, the winds of change blew as hard as they could possibly blow against Oregon State and Washington State, and they lose their coaches, their ADs. That said, very good hire, Wake Forest. I'm going to give this one A-. Doing more with less. You have to do that at Wazzu. You have to do that at Wake. I think Jake Dickert fits that well. I love what he did. Got the job under very weird circumstances. A lot of things working against him, and he just won. I like the hire. A- for Wake Forest. Bruce, where are you at on this one?
I like the hire as well. I think he did a terrific job under all sorts of crazy circumstances that you alluded to. I mean, there was a lot of tragedy. There was, I think, multiple, like a lot of those kids in that program when he took over. I think they had 2 different players who died that had been teammates at one point. Then they got off to a fast start last year. When I say last year, I mean 2020.
24, yeah. They were like 8-0 or... Yeah.
Well, 2023, I think. They got off to a fast start, and then they have a bye week. I think they're 4-0. And then just knowing guys on the staff, like the bottom dropped out because one of the guys said, I think it sunk in that we're not going to be with the rest of the Pac-12 anymore. And all the players just kind of like imploded at different times. I think he's a very good coach. I think it helps that he's coached at every level of imaginable in college football. It's a really tough job. And I think Dave Clawson did a really amazing job there. Now Dave is going to be around some, but still, you know, I would say probably it's a B+. You know, I don't know what their, what their options there were. I know that probably Neil Brown was somebody they looked at pretty closely, and you know, I think he probably would have fit pretty well there too. But I think it's Wake Forest. I think this is probably one of the better hires they probably could have made, to be honest.
Yeah, I went B+. Real solid coach, did a good job at a really tough spot. The second half swoons are what concerned me. Like two years in a row, they were like, became a top 25 team and collapsed down the stretch. This year they lost to Wyoming and New Mexico down the stretch. Could have won 10 games if they didn't, but good coach, good hire.